What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 109. I'm the co-host of the show, Kyle Lansloan, joined by the other co-host, Will Porter. Will, how you doing today?
Doing great, Kyle. Got a great episode today. How you doing, man?
Doing good. And our guest today is Connor Freeman. He's a writer at the Libertarian Institute and has been on, I don't know, 4 or 5 shows in the past now. Connor, how you doing today, buddy?
Pretty good, guys. Thank you. How are you doing?
Doing well and happy to have you back on. We have a topic, Connor, that's been
Thanks for having me.
hotly requested. I've had several people say, like, hey, what's going on? Tuesday, I got to start getting messages like, hey, is this going to be on the show? I was like, it's going to be Friday's show because we'll break down kind of what's been unfolding because there's so much going on. I think, reacting like on Tuesday maybe would have been early, but I think we have a pretty good idea of the picture here, who's bombing who, and all the little details of how this situation escalated. So all that on today's show. Be sure to share it. You can find video versions on YouTube and Odyssey. I will recommend the video version for this show just because we're going to have maps and some video clips to play to really try to capture, kind of what's happening in Israel and Gaza, Palestine, Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, Sheikh Jarrah, all these very important locations. And then we host the show at the Libertarian Institute. The show often runs at the blog on antiwar.com. You can also find the show on Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. And then you can support the show by supporting our sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com, or the new website is PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Either one of those places you go, you'll get the link to the great new website, and then you could get your great CBD products. Use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, for 25% off. Recently, I've really been enjoying their topical creams. I've been doing a little bit of hiking, get very sore the next day, and so I rub the topical sports cream on, and I feel great, good to go, no more sore back, legs, or anything like that. So check out, get whatever products that you think could help you. They have stuff for sleep, they have stuff for mental health, anxiety, again, pain relief. So Paloma Verde Store or PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Use the promo code PEACE, get yourself a discount. Now let's get into the show here and start breaking this down, Connor. I guess things really started to get, obviously this occupation has been going on for decades. And so one of the hard things about talking about Israel is where the hell do you ever start? And a lot of people, will say, hey, you're not starting far enough back. And, some people will go back literally to the founding of human beings, Adam and Eve, to like lay state to the claims of this land. So it could get a little complicated, but we're talking about what kind of happened, I guess, starting with Sheikh Jarrah, which is this neighborhood in Jerusalem, and we have a couple maps here. So this is a map of Jerusalem, and then I guess we zoom in and see East Jerusalem. We see the neighborhood Sheikh Jarrah, and there are 20 families or so that are getting evicted from that area, and their homes are likely going to go to settlers or somebody else. It's not a situation where like they're being evicted from their house or something like that, but their home is being stolen from them that they've lived in for decades and being given to somebody because of the ethnic differences of these people. So Connor, go ahead and fill us in on what's going on here.
Yeah. After the Nakba in '48, the sort of mass expulsion, forced exile of the Palestinians, about 750,000 people, I think 2/3 of the population of historic Palestine, was kicked off their land. And this is before the '67 war, when East Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza were occupied. So in the interim, between '48 and '67, the Jordanians basically had control over East Jerusalem. And so so a lot of these people who live in Sheikh Jarrah, they're refugees from the Nakba. And so a lot of what you'll hear from the Israelis is that these are Jewish homes, etc. But the truth is that they were actually the houses were built, they were financed by the Jordanian authorities. So at this point now, since the '67-day war, there have been, numerous sort of pseudo-legal justifications for basically how Israel has progressively annexed and finalizing that in 1980 with, I think it's the Basic Law of Jerusalem. So after 67, they essentially they extended what's called the municipalities ordinance law, and they basically extended Israeli administrative and law to East Jerusalem, and then the Interior Ministry was able to enlarge the boundaries. And with the Basic Law, then they were able to seize more control, and they basically defined it as the now always is it's so important that Trump moved the embassy because Jerusalem is truly the single unified capital of Israel. So they did that, and of course, contradicting international law, they annexed Jerusalem, or East Jerusalem, I should say. And so since then, and really since the early 70s, these Palestinians have been facing off lawsuits from Israeli settlers who have been trying to take their houses, and actually, I should say, more or less in East Jerusalem as well. But over the course of time in East Jerusalem, I mean, thousands of families have had their homes destroyed, and they've been kicked out of had their property taken from them and kicked off the land. But now, currently, there's two different settler organizations who have filed lawsuits in these kind of, the courts are obviously all geared. It's basically a rigged system, of course, in the apartheid state there. So, but essentially they've gone to these Israeli courts, and it's Nahalat Shimon International, which is a settler group that's actually based in the U.S., and then Ataret Kohanim, which is another settler group that's doing this. And they're about to, what they're trying to do is remove about 26 families. I think it's a total of 40 people, including 10 children. And so, for weeks now, there have been these protests across Palestine, and things have really gotten out of control because I believe the lower court approved these claims and the settlers' claims. And now I believe the Palestinians have, the people who own the houses have appealed this. And a Supreme Court was supposed to was supposed to basically hear these cases, but they've delayed and postponed it. And that's really happened over the last several days. And the worst of the tensions, I would say, probably really started at the end of last week, going through the weekend and really culminating with the things getting really out of control on Monday this week.
Yeah. So leading up to Monday, I know there were like several weeks of protests over this. Like these planned evictions, I think they had known about them for quite a while. And I had seen, like, just in the weeks leading up to the actual flare up of the real violence in Gaza, there had been all kinds of clashes, hundreds of people injured in some of these, like, there would be oftentimes a Palestinian gathering, and then the security forces come and crack down, and then you end up with this massive, like, show of unrest and again, hundreds of people injured. And so that just seemed to kind of like keep escalating and escalating until I believe it was Monday. You had this sort of gathering at the Aqsa mosque, which is like one of the primary the main holy sites in Islam. There was some gathering there, and there was some kind of crackdown, and it seems that really may have been one of the precipitating events that really sparked off some of these first like barrages of rocket fire. So, Connor, I'm not sure, where you want to start here with the Gaza thing. Just could you tell us some of what you've seen with the assault, the Israeli assault on Gaza, and some of the Palestinian militant action as well?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, I mean, really, what was going on was, in Jerusalem around the Aqsa Mosque, and also in Sheikh Jarrah, these settlers and the police were attacking people. There were clashes, but I mean, it's kind of an uneven battle there. So, I mean, a lot of people were getting shot with rubber bullets. There was a lot of tear gas. And we saw Israeli settlers driving into crowds of people. People being attacked at the mosque while they were doing their sort of evening prayers, in the last few nights of Ramadan, especially last Friday, where I believe hundreds of people were injured and actually hundreds were hospitalized as well. And on Friday, I want to say the Palestinian Red Crescent was reporting that a large number of injuries were to actually people's eyes and their heads from the rubber bullets. And so this had been going on, and some people have been detained. And so as this was all going down on Monday and really culminating at the mosque, and it looked like a war zone out there. The footage was going viral, and people were really calling attention to it. Hamas, essentially, or the Al Qassam Brigade, their sort of armed faction, issued an ultimatum to the Israelis saying withdraw from Al Mosque or from Al Mosque and from Sheikh Jarrah, Al-Aqsa Mosque, excuse me, and basically release people and the prisoners and get out of the area, withdraw. And the Israelis did not do that. So Hamas fired rockets in defense of the people there who were being attacked. And then after that, Israel launched airstrikes. And really, I mean, they killed, I think on the first day, I want to say 20 people, including 10 children.
Yeah.
Since then, it's been a cycle of escalation going back and forth. The Hamas has fired rockets back, and the Israelis have just, Netanyahu has said that they've hit hundreds of targets, and it just seems like there's no end in sight. Now the death toll, I believe, is over 80. Last I saw was 83 or 89, with almost 20 children killed.
Yeah, I just played one of the videos there from the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or at least it was a building on the Temple Mount complex. I saw some disputes over exactly what building it was. Nonetheless, it was a religious building, and there were people inside praying. And I saw some of the rounds that they were using. They were using, I don't know if they're stun grenades, but definitely sound grenades. Which I mean, if somebody threw one at me, I would assume it was a grenade. It's absolutely terrifying that they're rolling these around, and there's children and women present, clearly people who are not militants. Not that a praying man deserves to be hit with a sound grenade either, but just people who clearly are there praying are being harassed and beaten by soldiers, and then also shot with the rubber coated steel bullets, tear gas. Am I missing, Will or Connor, kind of any of the tactics they use? Because I think it is important to highlight that this is people praying in a religious building here. This is the level of the hostility from the Israeli state towards the just average Palestinian people. They like to portray this, I think, a lot as it being a clash between Hamas and Israel, but this isn't Hamas. These are just people being treated far worse than even what we see with the U.S. police. And that's not to minimize it or anything, but me and Will covered all summer the Black Lives Matter protests, and I mean, we played dozens of videos and talked about scores of examples of police acting with absolute brutality towards the Black Lives Matter protesters. But and at no point am I aware of did police go and kick down the doors of a black church and start throwing in tear gas and dragging people out for being there. So that this is kind of the level that we're talking about here, because I think maybe they'll say Hamas is overreacting, but I mean, who's gonna stand up for these people being dragged out of their place of worship?
Exactly. I mean, there's no the people in East Jerusalem and the West Bank don't have guns. The really only group that has the means to actually retaliate, or even, I mean, there's not much deterrence Hamas can really establish, but they're the only people who can actually impose any kind of consequences, really, on the Israeli regime. So as far as the tactics go, I have a report here from Mondo Weiss that's called "Hundreds Injured as Israeli Forces Attack Palestinian Worshippers in Jerusalem." And it says, video footage. Well, first of all, the height of the violence took place inside the mosque compound, where tens of thousands of worshippers had gathered inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the surrounding courtyard for evening prayers. And video footage from the scene shows people in prayer when armed Israeli forces stormed the compound, firing sound bombs, rubber bullets, and tear gas. and actually some of the footage that was coming out on Twitter at the time showed people like, you know, kneeling and doing their prayers, and you can actually hear the sound bombs going off and see the Israeli forces almost marching up behind them. It was actually quite terrifying. And as it says, the situation quickly devolved into chaos. Israeli forces forcefully dispersed groups of people in prayer. Palestinians in the compound responded by throwing chairs, shoes, and stones at the soldiers. And at one point in the evening, Palestinians had taken cover inside the mosque itself, which is, of course, is the third holiest site in Islam, where it came under attack from soldiers who were firing stun grenades and rubber bullets. And the Red Crescent said 205 people were injured. This was Friday night, including 88 who were hospitalized. Reports on the ground indicated that the Israeli forces were aiming at people's heads and faces with the rubber-coated bullets. So Israel considers these weapons crowd control measures. Their use of rubber bullets in occupied Palestinian territory has a long history of seriously maiming, injuring, and even killing Palestinian protesters. And the Red Crescent did confirm that many of the injuries sustained were to the head and eyes. At least one person lost their eye as a result, and 2 others reported to have suffered serious head wounds, and 2 Palestinians had their jaws fractured. And then they just deployed heavily into the area, and basically in and around the old city. And it's a lot of it is essentially the sound bombs and the tear gas and the rubber bullets. But of course, you have, I mean, lately what's been going on, even in places like Sheikh Jarrah, you have kind of a combo of the settlers going in there and harassing people and chanting death to Arabs and pepper spraying their iftar table, like when they break the fast in solidarity with the families who are facing eviction. You know, Itmar Ben-Gvir, who's the leader of this sort of neo-fascist Jewish Power Party, which is sort of, he's a real sort of disciple of the assassinated Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was actually killed by, you know, when Zawahiri, Ayman al-Zawahiri's Egyptian Islamic Jihad was merging with bin Laden's group in the early 90s. I think it's like really the first official like foreign Al-Qaeda work.
Connor, is this a group that's been chanting death to Arabs in Jerusalem, or is that a different group?
Well, his group, Jewish Power, I'm not sure, because he certainly, like, he and his followers are involved doing that. So they were chanting death to Arabs at people in Sheikh Jarrah who were actually, you know, breaking their fast and protesting and in solidarity. And then you have, I mean, things are really getting out of control in the last few weeks. There was a march led by a group called Lahava, which is essentially a real, like, hate group. And they're really dedicated, as it says, to restore Jewish dignity to the city, which essentially means, you know, as it says, death to Arabs and may your village burn. So these people are fanatics. I mean, there was reports of people like driving around and shooting their gun out of their car. Let's see, videos and photos of Israeli mobs harassing and attacking Palestinian pedestrians, attacking buses and homes with rocks. One video of a group showed Israeli youth pelting rocks at a Palestinian home inside the old city as the screams and cries of children inside the home could be heard in the background. We've seen some other videos just like that actually from the last day or two. But what what actually, as far as Ben-Gvir goes, Haaretz even said that one of a social media group that he administers, one person in the group actually called for Palestinians to be hung and said, quote, "We're burning Arabs today. The Molotov cocktails are already in the trunk." So, yeah, I mean, it's just, so, I mean, as Netanyahu tries to sort of pull a government together and with all the kind of the never-ending cycle of him being on trial for corruption and not being able to build a government, we're seeing a rise of, there's a guy named Besamel Smotrich who runs the group called, a faction called like Religious Zionism. And Itmar Ben-Gvir is really sort of associated with them, but he has his own group called Jewish Power. And they're very appealing. There's like this kind of the idea of like, you know, Meir Kahane and his sort of enthusiastic endorsement of just outright ethnic cleansing and real, like, you know, hatred of Palestinians and violence against them openly in the streets is becoming quite popular with large segments of the Israeli youth. I mean, last night we saw in Israel proper, in cities like Lod and Bet Yam, just these mass riots of Palestinian and Arab-owned businesses being smashed and destroyed, passersby being attacked, you know, cars being like surrounded, and then people trying to pull people out of their cars and attacking them, and they're swerving all over the road to try and get away and get to safety. I mean, it absolutely looks like just chaos. Now, the Israelis, I believe, have imposed a curfew in Lod. I'm not sure about Bet Yam, but they've issued a curfew, and supposedly they're even. I saw something on Twitter about reporting that that they had introduced. I think it's called administrative detention or something like that, which essentially means they're detaining people without charges, which, you know, happens to Palestinians often. But I mean, ostensibly it's supposed to contain the rioters, but you know, it's kind of, you know, a lot of these factions. I mean, like Itmar Ben Gvir is in the Knesset, so it's almost like he's got brown shirts in the streets actually doing, you know, his violence, and he endorses all this. You know, it's so. I don't know where we go from here, but he had set up actually. He was even setting up a provisional office in Sheikh Jarrah, right across from the people that are being evicted, and that's where, you know, a lot of trouble was getting started. They've since moved it out. I think they were ordered to, but yeah, just these factions are just out of control as far as the violence against Palestinians. It's devastating.
Yeah. So
no, Kyle, just to
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to drive one point home. Can we pull up the maps again of East Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah, just to show, because we did see them earlier, but I just wanted to point out that these red areas you see up in the top and down in the bottom left corner, those are settlements. So these are illegal Israeli settlements, illegal under international law, that are set up right next to this neighborhood. And they're often protected by the Israeli security forces, these settlements. That's who serves them. And so you're talking about like often a very heavily militarized area. So like when we're talking about these like riots and stuff that are happening, and the like these mobs going around, like there are cops, there are security forces all over these areas, but oftentimes I think they are kind of looking the other way and letting these things happen. So I just thought that was important to show, you know, that this area is right next to settlements, and it's not, I don't know, it's people try to make this issue about like, you know, Palestinians not paying rent or something, but it's very clearly, you know, part and parcel of this like decades long settlement project there in that neighborhood.
And well, one of the things that I'll add to that, and you talk about the heavily armed presence, it is because I'm sure there's going to be somebody who hears what Connor just said, and their immediate response is, well, the Arabs chant death to Israel, and, you know, they have their own rhetoric that is hostile towards the Israelis. But if you look at who's armed, who has weaponry, who can actually hurt the other party, it's the Israelis that could hurt the Palestinians. And, you know, especially when we're talking about this area, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, where there's not a militarized Palestinian force at all. So in all these areas, there's nobody to stand up for the Palestinians, like physically on the ground. There's not like Palestinians to show up with rifles and to say like, you can't steal this house. Now, you know, in Gaza, there is Hamas, that is an armed group, and they, you know, have rockets that they have been shooting into Israel. And all that. But even there, if you look at the disparity, they've killed like 6, I believe now, people in Israel with their rockets versus I heard 89 about before recording this show, people in Gaza who were killed. And even with, you know, Israel supposed to have the advanced equipment and everything, they've killed a hell of a lot more civilians than the Hamas has. I think it's like 17 children and 7 women now, where the Hamas rockets, I believe they say, 1 child maybe, and then 1 or 2 women. So again, it's all tragic.
I heard a soldier got killed, and it's something like 7 Israelis total at this point.
Okay, yeah, that sounds
that
sounds like updated numbers to me. So yeah, but anyway, just the disparity of force and the ability, you know, to use it is something that's worth talking about. And I mean, you know, any American would have no problem seeing the difference between somebody saying white supremacy and black supremacy. I mean, the disparities are even more when you talk about, you know, Israel and Gaza and who has the ability to stand up for themselves there. but just as a way to think about for an American who's like, the other side says some too that there's no like real equivalent between what the Israelis and the Palestinians can do. Am I missing anything on that general topic? Because these are tough things to talk about for anybody watching the video version and seeing that these Israeli youth go around and smash up a Palestinian owned ice cream parlor. It's uncomfortable to watch, or some of the car ramming incidents that I've seen. That one guy in particular tried to just murder some Palestinian guy with his car. And then also one of the more shocking videos that I saw was when there was a fire on the Temple Mount one night. Apparently a firework, I don't know who fired it, landed in a tree and set the tree on fire. There were some reports saying that the Dome on the Rock or the mosque itself was burning. Fortunately, that wasn't the case. I mean, it's sad that this tree burned down. This is supposed to be a place of peace, but at the same time it is just a tree. But the reaction from the Israelis are outside celebrating that this is on fire, and it's just it's such another telling thing where there's so much hatred between the people of Israel, and again they're backed by a very, very powerful military and police force.
Sure. And I'll add. Jonathan Cook has a great article that you posted at antiwar.com called "Jerusalem Protests: The Mob Breaking Faces Learned from Israel's Establishment." And actually, that when he's talking about break their faces, a lot of these sort of groups that I was referring to earlier that are connected to Smotrich and Ben Gvir were talking about how on WhatsApp how they were going to go out and break people's faces, and actually some of them, as Cook says, made good on that promise. And so basically what he was talking about is how a lot of, if you follow like good leftist accounts on Twitter or Palestinian accounts, for years we've been seeing footage come out of the West Bank, especially of just severe violence waged against Palestinians on the part of Israeli security forces, on the part of from settlers. There's one of the finest documentaries I've seen actually on the West Bank was Matthew Ho and Ray McGovern with Veterans of Peace for Peace went to the West Bank around the time that Ahed Tamimi was in the news quite a bit, and the Tamimi families, their heroic sort of protests against what was going on there, and the you see very closely like what's actually happening and how these people have essentially no due process, no freedom. And they can basically be expropriated at will by the Jewish settlers, and then those settlers in turn are backed by the security forces, and the security forces are in turn backed by the U.S. government, and of course. So, but what he was talking about, Cook, is in this article, is that that kind of West Bank violence has been moved into central Jerusalem, and that essentially that there's these younger sort of more fanatical Zionists who are not content with, the drawn out process of taking these people's land and the ethnic cleansing campaign that has taken decades. They want to sort of cut to the chase. And so now we're seeing that kind of the culture of violence that you're used to in the West Bank come into central Jerusalem. And he goes, equally significant, these Jewish mobs have carried out their rampages during Ramadan, the Muslim holy month of fasting. He says the visibility and premeditation of this gang violence has discomfited many Israelis, but in the process, they've been given a close-up view of how appealing the violent anti-Arab doctrines of Rabbi Meir Kahane, the ideological inspiration behind Jewish power, proving with significant sections of young Jews in Israel. And one sporting a Kahane was right badge spoke for her peers as she was questioned on Israeli TV about the noisy chants of "May your village burn down," a reference to this price tag arson attacks committed by the Israeli far right against Palestinian communities in the occupied territories and inside Israel. And olive groves, mosques, cars, and homes are regularly torched by these Jewish extremists who claim Palestinian lands as their exclusive biblical birthright. The woman responded in terms that she obviously thought conciliatory. I don't say that a Palestinian village should burn down, but that you should leave the village and we'll go live in it. She and others now sound impatient to bring forward the day when Palestinians must leave. So, I mean, that's essentially what we're seeing, and it's more or less encouraged by people in the government, it seems like. And when over Sunday, Jake Sullivan called Meir Ben Shabbat, his counterpart in Israel, and basically said, we've got concerns and this sort of thing. Shabbat told him, stay out. Like, this is none of your business, and this is an issue of our sovereignty. And let's see if I can get some of the quotes. He said, let's see, this is a report from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, and he says, Ben Shabbat told Sullivan the U.S. and other countries to stay out of the conflict, said international pressure on Israel to halt the evictions or stop the violence would be a prize for the rioters and those sending them who hope to put pressure on Israel. Ben Shabbat also said Israel was handling the situation out of a position of sovereignty, responsibly, and with common sense, despite the provocations. So... like you said about there not being any armed factions, saving, aside from Hamas, the U.S., we provide them $10 million of aid every day, $3.8 billion a year. And they're, it's, as you pointed out, the whole thing is like, you're not a real American politician if you don't support unconditional aid to Israel. So the idea is like, we have no... we don't have any influence, and the whole thing is against international law. I mean, the UN has issued numerous resolutions saying that all of this stuff is inadmissible, whether it's through the administrative kind of, like I said, the kind of faux legalization of the expropriation and the theft, or the actual outright, violent conquest and theft. That all of it's inadmissible and illegal, and that humanitarian international law is, operating in the occupied territories. But so like the UN doesn't have any power to change this, it seems like, and the US will not exert any pressure, won't condition aid, or certainly won't pull back aid. So it's just going to keep going, because it looks like, as we can see, everybody from Ned Price to Jen Psaki to Jake Sullivan to Joe Biden to Anthony Blinken, all the, Linda Thomas Greenfield, it's just the UN ambassador. It's just complete lockstep. Israel has a right to defend itself, and they will not even condemn the evictions or the bombings of children, as we've seen. It's the most nakedly pathetic. Frankly, it's embarrassing as an American to see this happen.
Yeah.
I mean, it's predictable, but it's disgusting and embarrassing.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into the U.S. reaction. I think we've covered about everything going on the ground in Israel, maybe except the actual exchanges between Israel and Hamas in Gaza and Israel. It seems to me that I guess Hamas attack is about what their capabilities are, that they're firing rockets into Israel. They fire enough at a time that they could somewhat overwhelm the Iron Dome system, but at the same time, if you look at the videos, it seems like the Iron Dome is somewhat effective in taking out a lot of these rockets. I haven't read any reports of any particular new technology Hamas is employing. Here, I know in the past, they've introduced rockets with like longer range or something like that. But from my understanding, these are all like either ballistic missiles or rockets that are just on a single trajectory path. They're not like firing off cruise missiles or using drones or anything with a particularly long range or reach. Israel has responded with, I think, airstrikes and drone strikes, and they've taken down at least 2, maybe 3 now residential, like high-rise buildings. And then depending on who dies is who you ask, but it does seem that several children have been killed. You can see some video footage put out from Gaza that definitely shows some dead children. I'm guessing the Israeli media is correct with the 7 dead. Am I missing any other like significant details that either of you guys think we should add about this? It's been going on for a few days. It seems relatively consistent.
Yeah, Kyle, I think your rundown is accurate. Like I had seen a lot of the same things. Swarms of Hamas rocket fired these what they call the Qassam rockets, which, as you said, are just dumb rockets that have no guidance at all. They just lob them over and hope they hit something of value. But yeah, I also saw the Iron Dome seems to be taking out most of them. The Israelis have responded. They've like taken, I think, maybe even 4 high-rise buildings now, some housing media organizations. They've also been doing these targeted assassinations. The IDF, I know, has been bragging a lot on Twitter about who it's been killing. It's telling us who, like these various Hamas operatives that it's been killing. I wasn't familiar with any of the people that it had named, but they're apparently doing these high-value targeting things as well in Gaza. So yeah, we've seen this happening, I think, since Monday. I haven't actually looked today. Have you guys seen, like, I assume there's probably been more exchanges today as Thursday, I mean.
Well, I feel like so I mean I don't have maybe I could find the printouts, but so Will, when you and Kyle, when you guys checked the death tolls for Gaza this morning, wasn't it in the 60s, and now it's all of a sudden, like in the last few hours, up in the 80s? I
Yeah.
The
mean,
last I had seen it was 67, but I didn't check since last night.
it's
So
up to like 83 or 89 now. I mean,
Yeah.
so I mean, I assume that they're bombing. They could be bombing bombing Gaza now. Like it doesn't. I mean, they've even explicitly said, like Aviv Kohavi has said, he's been quoted as saying that this will be an indefinite campaign. And in fact, I just pulled up because I couldn't remember it exactly, but Gantz, the defense minister, you're referring to the towers being brought down in Gaza, and Gantz said towers will continue to crumble. There are a lot of targets in line. This is just the beginning. And then Aaron Mate quote tweeted that saying, the great journalist, and said, towers will continue to crumble. The words of a terrorist regime. It's like, I don't even.
That was a great catch on Aaron's part.
Yeah.
I will add that I saw in an AP article that Israel had also hit a medical production facility and a dental clinic, and I think it's worth noting that, look, if anything gets blown up in Israel, like let's say like the Palestinians happen to hit worst case scenario, a school or a medical clinic, and it burns to the ground, that's tragic that happened, but the Israelis can rebuild that, and they have enough money. It's a fairly wealthy country. They get billions of dollars in aid every year from the US. They also would be able to like fundraise or get the money. The Palestinians, specifically in Gaza, have trouble because Israel essentially blockades and don't have a port. That they can't get construction material in, and so there's already tons of people in Gaza who don't have adequate housing. You're destroying like some of their main housing units. You're destroying again medical equipment and facilities. These won't be rebuilt, and so it's going to be a far more lasting and destructive problem for Gaza than it is for Israel. Well, tragic on both sides. This is going to kill for years in the future when it comes to Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, there's Abby Martin's documentary, Gaza Fights for Freedom,
Which
which is
is
about
now
like the
out
great.
for free on YouTube, by the way.
Yeah, there's footage in there in the beginning of a farmer who, because of the blockade, is unemployed. He's got a family of 16, and to make $6 to $9 a day, he says he goes through the rubble and tries to find like stones and metals and things that he can sell with like a donkey and carrying the load. And it's the most devastating, like disgusting thing. I mean, the unemployment is out of control. People can't. The Israelis say we're putting them on a diet and limit. Like they basically they allow in the minimal amount of food to for the caloric intake to stave off malnutrition. And that's it. So people like they don't have electricity except for like 4 hours a day. So their food spoils. It's just like he said, like he goes, one of them, somebody is quoted in there in Gaza, he says like Gaza doesn't exist anymore. Like Gaza is a skeleton of itself. I mean, and the parts of it do look like what you're saying. It's just everything. It's just rubble, and it's just so yeah. I mean, like it is even in that sense, like you're saying, and even like you said with the schools, some of these rockets from Gaza, like I think they announced that they were using a new rocket today. I forget exactly the name of it, but it seemed like Hamas was more impressed with it than anybody else. In fact, I heard that one of the rockets didn't even get over didn't even go into Israel. It went back into the Gaza Strip, like it fell back. And so, I mean, you consider the number of rockets, like, so if you put that on like CNN and you're like, oh, look, hundreds of rockets are being fired into it. But like the damage in Israel is so relatively minimal that even that should make people think just like, whoa, you're sending in hundreds of rockets. And sometimes people say thousands, and 7 people have been killed over how many days now? It's Thursday.
Right.
It started on Monday. It's just incredible. And so
Yeah.
I mean, we'll see.
I've talked about this on the show in the past, but a real red pill for me on this issue was, I think in 2012, they were talking about, oh, all the rockets, the rockets, the rockets. And then they started posting pictures of them on Twitter. And I've seen science experiments bigger rockets. Now, they, weren't designed to kill. They were designed to go up and come down. I understand that there's a difference. I'm just saying that some of these rockets are very not impressive at all. And so it's not as if, these are 500, 1,000 Tomahawk missiles coming down, raining down in Israel. These are, small, very, very small rockets with like small charges. I think, Will, there was a quote like, you have to hit them right here in the forehead, somebody says. And I'm sure they have.
Pepe.
Yeah, I'm sure they have upgraded since 2012, right? That they may be somewhat more impressive, but they're still nowhere near an F-35. Gaza doesn't have an Iron Dome or an Air Force or anything that I think hovers above the ground at all. Israel's destroying some of the tallest buildings in Gaza as we speak. So,
yeah. I keep seeing these reports that are referring to like Palestinian or Hamas airstrikes. They're calling them airstrikes, implying that Hamas has some kind of air force. It's like, wow, their warplanes are so stealthy. Nobody's ever seen one before. It's incredible. But no, what you're talking about with the rockets, Kyle, I think is absolutely correct. You're talking about like, a rocket that can do like, it can damage your exterior wall, or if it hits you while you're in your car, like it will probably kill you.
It could start a fire.
Right. But we're talking about missiles that can bring down an apartment block.
Yeah,
we're talking about leveling, like demolishing buildings, not just damaging the exterior wall or something. And I don't mean to, like those 7 people who have died, like, they have families and stuff. That totally sucks. But I'm just saying, on like the scale of military power here, we are not talking about something that's like that ferocious. These are homemade weapons. The Qassam rockets are like jerry-rigged, like ghetto kind of things. This is not like military grade stuff that they're getting from Lockheed Martin, like the way, the Israelis are.
Right.
So it's like when Saudi and Yemen is like, well, they hit our oil facilities.
Right.
It's
right.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Well, then I guess it's kind of a both sides are wrong thing,
Yeah, maybe. Well, let's go ahead and touch on that real quick, because that's like one. I guess the like half woke people think that they have like this great narrative where like they also condemn Israel. Like, I'm better than Andrew Yang. The Israelis are terrorists and the Palestinians are terrorists. How enlightened am I? And that kind of thing really just drives me nuts. We'll get into the net price statement next, but let's talk about that. Connor, I'll let you kind of take on that myth here, because it is one of the, I feel like even libertarians I'm seeing quite a bit are kind of having this like both sides taken. It's infuriating to me.
Yeah, I mean, like, you're bombing an open-air prison that's been under an air, land, and sea blockade. I think the statistic is like something like 97% of their water is contaminated. They can't even get fresh water. It's like, well, I mean, it's almost nearly impossible, and they have a very small amount. And it's like, like you said about the rockets, like they can't even. There's no. It's such an uneven fight. I mean, you're talking about a state that's armed with nuclear weapons, drones, tanks, F-15s, state-of-the-art technology, the Iron Dome. Alon Omar was bringing that up the other day. Actually, he goes, Israeli airstrikes killing civilians in Gaza an act of terrorism. Palestinians deserve protection. Unlike Israel, missile defense programs such as Iron Dome don't exist to protect Palestinian civilians. It's unconscionable to not condemn these attacks on the week of Eid. And it's like, they don't control their airspace. They don't control their shores. Even the fishermen often get blown out of the water when you just get out a few nautical miles outside the shore. The whole place is completely locked down. These people are basically starved. There's no. It's like the sort of the Hasbara about Israel, about them being the victims, the perpetual victims acting in self-defense. Whatever we can say about Hamas, and I like what Katie Halper said on Twitter earlier, which is like, talk to me about what Hamas is doing when we fund them for decades and support them and brag about our special relationship with them. Right. It's just say what you will, but it's like it's just unconscionable. It's not the same thing at all. I mean, one group is totally essential. The West Bank is totally disarmed. They're having their homes destroyed. The Israelis are not, like I said, the Hasbara, the sort of macho victimhood, that whole thing. It's I think Scott says, like, if you zoom in a little closer on that, you'll see that the victims who are boxed in this little state that's attacked and besieged on the north and south, that's the Gaza Strip. You know, so it's the whole thing is completely backwards in the U.S. mainstream media. And then you have, people like for years, like, Jon Stewart and Trevor. I just saw some clip I literally couldn't get through of Trevor Noah talking about Israel Palestine. He's like, Israel versus Palestine. I know I'm already going to lose followers for just saying that. It's one of the most he says it's the most complicated conflict. He goes, in our lifetimes. It's so complicated, like it's a Rubik's cube. It's like 1,000 Rubik's cubes to figure out, and we've got the best experts working on it. They just can't figure it out. I think what's her name? Wonder Woman. Gal Gadot. Yeah. She just said, it's like, she goes, what was it? Yeah, exactly. Because it's an endless cycle. And I forget who tweeted it, but it was like, yeah, occupation is not it's not a cycle.
Right, and so she just says Israel and its neighbors, too, like as if she's talking about some country next door and not like this occupied helot, population of this defeated, conquered Indian reservation. Its neighbors, like, the country next door.
Unbelievable. And, they just bombed Syria, 3 times last week, and this week with, like, out in the open, broad daylight with an Israeli helicopter. They bombed Syria hundreds of times throughout the whole Syrian war. I mean, it was largely instigated at the behest of, Israeli influence on that American policy is just as strong as the Saudi influence on that, policy. So it's no, I mean, and look at Natanz. I mean, it just the aggression of the Israelis is it's very similar to what America does, essentially. Like, we're never wrong. We're always acting in defense of freedom and our people and our civilians. And, basically you can get away with anything.
Right.
So the media is so powerful. And like I said, I mean, for the longest time, I thought, I almost didn't pay attention because I was like, oh, yeah, well, it probably is complicated and I got to focus on, like, what America's doing. But this is what America's doing.
Yep.
Right. Yeah, it's not complicated either. It's just long. There's just a lot of information and history to learn. It's not like it's some complicated, like a math equation or something. You just got to read and figure it out. I don't know. It's not that. There's a couple sides. There's various factions, and I don't know. It's not like you said 1,000 Rubik's cubes or 4D chess or something. It's just history.
Yeah. I mean, it's also important to remember that, like, you could also look at the situation on the ground now. The Palestinians aren't orcs, right? They're not going to just break down the gates and act like zombies and go kill every Jew. Like, that's their people, right? They just want to be free and live their lives. And so even if 50, 100 years ago, something else happened and, for whatever reason, the Israelis felt like they needed to be protected. Now, the Palestinians have absolutely nothing, especially the people in Gaza. You talked about how terrible the situation is there. And we still, pretend like, oh, well, it's about 50-50 and, we'll see which way this thing goes. So, to talk about the U.S. response here, we had an interesting statement from Ned Price, who's the spokesperson for the Secretary of State. And he gets grilled a little bit, Will. Can you set up who the journalist is? I think you actually know his name. And we'll go ahead and play this clip that's about 2.5 minutes.
Oh, man, I only remember his first name. It's Matt something. I wish I remembered that.
Is it Matt Lee?
I think it might be. The AP reporter?
Yeah.
Look at that.
I forget the guy from Al Quds. I don't remember his name, but I think it's Matt Lee.
Principle of self-defense.
I'm asking if you think that the principle of self-defense applies to the retaliatory the airstrikes that they're conducting in response.
Matt, this is a very fluid situation. I would hesitate to comment on operations beyond the rocket fire that is clearly targeting innocent civilians in Israel. So I would hesitate to speak to specific operations that have just occurred. But the broader principle of self-defense is something we stand by on behalf of Israel and every other country.
Do you think that an Israeli military response to the rockets coming in, a military response to the rockets coming in is covered by this broader rubric of self-defense, right?
Self-defense often does authorize the use of
Secondly, on
force.
this,
Thank you, Matt. I want to ask you about East Jerusalem, but let's talk about what you said about the principle of self-defense. Does that in any way apply to the Palestinians? Do they have a right to self-defense? Do Palestinians have a right to self-defense?
I'm in broadly speaking, Saeed, we believe in the concept of self-defense. We believe it applies to any state. I don't think that I certainly wouldn't want my words to be construed as.
I understand. I want to ask you on Jerusalem. I don't want to harp on this either, but the Israelis killed 13 people just now, including maybe 5 or 6 children. Do you condemn that? Do you condemn the killing of children?
Saeed,
I'm asking, do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging. Obviously, the deaths of civilians, be they Israeli or Palestinians, are something we would take very seriously.
Okay.
You're going to know as soon as I read what your answer was that there's a big problem with it. You said, well, not a problem, it just doesn't answer the question. We believe that it, meaning the right to self-defense, applies to any state. Well, you see the problem, right? Yes?
Do you want to?
Do you regard Palestine as a state?
I wasn't
Do you
referring.
think that, you
But
don't in the context of the ICC and the UN. So are you
and-
saying that you do not, if it applies to any state, are you saying that Palestinians don't have a right to self-defense?
I was making a broader point, not attached to Israel or the Palestinians in that case.
So they do have a right to self-defense.
Matt, I'm
I
not.
don't know. It's not that
I'm not
difficult
in a
a
position to debate the legalities
right.
from up here. What our message is one of de-escalation.
I don't know how frustrated I would have been to be the reporter in that room, but I mean, not only does he essentially refuse to answer the question, but the only time he'll comment is when it's in defense of Israel. Anytime it's in defense of Palestine, well, I don't know the detail. I would hesitate. I don't know.
Right.
It's absolutely crazy. Well, wait, what was your take on that clip?
I mean, yeah, I think Connor kind of mentioned this earlier. This is the refrain always from U.S. officials over and over again. Israel has a right to defend itself. And they just kind of, what that does is just completely strips everything of any context. Because, like self-defense is completely dependent on context. Like, are you the aggressor? Are you attacking someone? Or are you responding to their previous use of force against you? That's all completely, contextual and relative. And they just want to completely erase all of that. And when these reporters press them on that directly, like, look, do the Palestinians have a right to self-defense? Because arguably what's happening to them constitutes aggression, and that they have a right to respond to that, don't they? And no, of course not. Like this only goes in one direction. And it's a very useful, the AP reporter, Matt Lee, pointed this out. It's a very useful formulation when he says any state has the right of self-defense. Because obviously the Palestinians are a sort of stateless people. They have their own kind of semi, institutions, but ultimately they are under the control of the Israeli state everywhere. Sort of even in Gaza, where there's there's not an occupation anymore. They pulled out the troops in 2005, but there's now a blockade where they control everything going in and out of the territory. So I don't know, this formulation of states have the right to self-defense is very convenient when they're talking about Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, and I mean, I honestly couldn't tell if he was being like, the way he goes, "Oh, we believe in all state." Like, how that seemed like it was a snide kind of remark. He meant to say it that way, to make the point that essentially the Palestinian, and I believe that actually. I don't see how it couldn't not be the case that the American position is that the Palestinians do not have a right to self-defense. And then the fact that everybody was seeing those reports of the airstrikes and the al-Masri, the two siblings, I believe it was Ibrahim and Marwan, the 7-year-old and 11-year-old siblings who have been killed, and the father was being quoted, and we've seen that 20 people. I think all that had been reported essentially, and maybe not just them, but it's hard to tell, with everything. A lot of this all came out very quickly on Monday evening and or throughout the day, and but I mean, of course, it was nighttime over there. But the way he goes, we haven't seen the facts on the ground. That's a term that the Israelis use anyway to describe, like, we're going through the peace process, but we establish facts on the ground, which essentially means settlements and further expansion into basically Palestinian territory, the occupied territories, and taking people's land and expanding the Israeli footprint. So I don't even know. I mean, like, Ned Price just seems like, he reminds me of Sullivan, frankly, the way he looks and just that kind of heartless, like, inhumanity of the whole presentation. So
yeah, he seemed out of his league a little bit too there. One thing we should mention, we have this here, which is Biden's statement, which was more Israel has a right to defend itself. But in maybe less bad news, there have been some U.S. politicians that have really, like, not just like, said something about it, but have been strong and firm and are taking the correct position. Ilhan Omar being probably the most vocal, and then Rashid Tlaib being another. But essentially all four members of the squad have been somewhat vocal on this issue. Ilhan Omar retweeted Biden's statement and, I mean, really condemned it in pretty strong terms. There was no like, oh, well, Trump was even worse, crap coming out of her mouth. I was fairly impressed with the statements coming from the squad. And I will say I've been somewhat surprised by the number of, not that there's a lot, but people in the establishment who are taking like a somewhat firm position, against what's happening to the Palestinians. Even if it's not like necessarily pro-Palestinian, they are mostly just concerned about condemning what Israel's doing. In fact, there was a letter that apparently got 25 signatures urging Blinken to confirm the Sheikh Jarrah evictions, which was far more than I would have thought. And apparently the people circulating the letters were even a little bit surprised by that. One more thing I'll note is there was this particular Palestinian who I guess lives in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, who got on CNN and had this great 15-second clip. I'll go ahead and play it now.
Do you support the protests, the violent protests that have erupted in solidarity with you and other families in your position right now?
Do you support the violent dispossession of me and my family?
So really, this is beautiful because he just turns it right around. And it's something that most of us are going to face when we're talking about the Israel-Palestine subject, and you try to, take the position, defend the Palestinians there and come at you and say, oh, you're defending Hamas and Iran and all this violence. You say, no, you're supporting the violence, against the Palestinians first. So I thought that was a pretty great thing that is getting out into the mainstream media a little bit, although most of the headlines and coverage is like the very typical pro-Israel cover up the Israeli war crime kind of stuff.
I saw some of there are a few weird instances, like the New York Post reversed the actual like data where the headline, I think, did you guys see this? I don't know how quickly they changed it, but it basically said Hamas airstrikes killed 20, including 10 children in Israel.
Yeah, I did see that.
Just unbelievable. And then what was it? A lot of people were pointing out. Now, this headline I saw from AP, but also some other outlets. I don't remember who originated with it, but I felt like a few different outlets ran with it, where they were saying essentially like 20 people, including 10 children, killed in Gaza or in fighting with Israel. And so people were like, oh, really? How are the children fighting with Israel? Like, just the way it's phrased. Like, they killed a 7-year-old and an 11-year-old, like I said earlier. It's so, just the way it's framed. And there's a lot of stuff like the New York Times or one of these major papers had a thing like where it said the Israelis were killed, but when they refer to the Gazan casualties, they died in fighting. Like they died in the, we don't even know how it happened. It's
like
just
passively.
Just happenstance.
Right.
Yeah, I'm trying to look real quick. Somebody had a great article on that today at Salon. I think it was Branko Marchteach. I hope I'm saying his name right, but that is at
from
Salon.
Jacob.
Yeah, Yeah, titled or maybe Jacobin. It's titled "On Palestine, the Media is Allergic to the Truth." Oh, it is at Jacobin. Sorry about that. Yeah, so that's a
No,
really good one to look at. And it breaks down all those headlines and misleading stuff. Guys, we're getting at an hour here, so we should probably wrap up soon. But Connor and Will, if you have like one more little aspect of this that you want to like hit on before we wrap up, something kind of quick to go over that I feel like is really important. I know that there's so much to this, but I just want the listeners to be armed with as many facts as possible, because I really do think this is an important stand to take, even for libertarians. This is a key part of the U.S. empire in the war state, and taking like I don't know, halfway sides on this isn't right. That that's like saying that, oh, Saddam was a really bad guy. No, we killed a lot of Iraqis, but Saddam or Gaddafi was terrible. That can't be what we do here.
Yeah, I guess as a final takeaway, I guess I would just reiterate that, like, we are not talking about two equal sides, two nation states with their own, national militaries and stuff, with massive, budgets and all these things. We are talking about two very unequal sides. One side is sort of this, like, dispossessed and defeated and conquered population that lives in these hemmed-in little territories, versus one of the world's most powerful nation states with the most powerful militaries. Certainly in the region, the most powerful, but in the world, I think it has like the fourth largest army or something. It's a very powerful military. So like there is just an extreme disparity between the two sides, and I don't know. I think that's just one thing that we should really drive home, is that we're not talking about again, two countries fighting each other. This is a country fighting a dispossessed, defeated, conquered group of people.
Yeah, I think for libertarians, I may be paraphrasing, but I remember reading some article from the early '80s. Murray Rothbard made the point that Israel is libertarian in its whole kind of the whole basis of its project, of the Zionist project. It's about, like you said, this is a conquered, occupied, or exiled people who have been driven from their homes at gunpoint and then repressed for decades. And like we said, it's an open air prison. You can call it what you want. It's an open air concentration camp. It gets bombed. And the bombings of Gaza, I mean, they have, like I said, if you follow these accounts, you'll see, like Palestinian accounts, there's a hashtag that's been going around for years. I think it's Gaza under attack. And you'll see that. I mean, it's hard to keep track, but it seems like a week doesn't go by without seeing that. And it's just, you can't even imagine what it would be like to be born in Gaza or to just live there with your family. You're absolutely helpless. I saw a video of a kid, a little boy running. His father was being carried out in a stretcher after the bombings by a bunch of people who were carrying some. Yeah, and he's crying with the horror of not having his father there anymore, and we're paying for that. And the whole idea that, like, we're going to talk about how Israel has a right to exist on somebody else's land where you violently throw them out of their home. I mean, these videos coming out, which are really vivid, of, even the police in people's homes. I think that was in Nazareth, actually, but I might be wrong about that. But there's an incredible video that came out of settlers barging into the door. You see a father and his son, it looked like a father and his son, trying to desperately keep the door closed. Yeah, this is it. And then the mother runs back to the back room of the house, and you can hear her daughters crying, terrified, just living under constant terror of just being brutalized at the whim of somebody who wants to take your stuff. And it's part of the whole policy that we underwrite every single day. And I'll just point out that, for people who are concerned about blowback, I mean, it's such a, so, I mean, if you lost your, I always try to think of it this way. If you lost your father or your family member on 9/11, I think people should really understand. My dad was actually supposed to be on one of the flights on 9/11, I think 175, and made a schedule change, thankfully, like 2 weeks before. And if he had been on there, like, I grew up most of my life thinking, I don't know what exactly, you live in America, you think that we were attacked for being free. These people are like militant, people out of their minds, like who knows what they're mad about, freedom or whatever. And but then you look into it and you find out that the lead hijackers, the Hamburg cell, that like when Scott Horton talks about, and Lawrence Wright in The Looming Tower, Terry McDermott in Perfect Soldiers, they talk about these guys. The whole thing was really, Muhammad Atta signing his last will and testament after Operation Grapes of Wrath got kicked off in April of '96. Bin Laden's first fatwa, declaration of war against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places, specifically talks about the first Qana massacre, where the Israelis blew up a UN shelter housing like 106, I think largely women and children, with their limbs and arms blown off. People seeing this on TV in the Levant, and just, these guys are in Germany. They're engineering students, and they see what's going on, and they said, we're going to attack Americans because they're responsible for this. The Americans are underwriting the dictatorships that impose the tyrannies that we live under, and as well as the Israeli occupations and their wars against southern Lebanon. And like 20,000 people got killed in the war and occupation in southern Lebanon from '82 to 2000. And so like what Bin Laden said was, well, how come our blood is water? Your blood is blood, but our blood is water. So it's just interesting to me. Like, I think people really need to understand, with all this sort of MAGA America First stuff. I think Glenn Greenwald was talking about this too. Like, how do you reconcile that with the Israeli partisanship that was really epitomized by people like Pompeo and Trump? So I just think people should keep that in mind. That if you don't, it's a relatively low risk. But 9/11, a lot of people's lives got ruined that day. And I think it should be brought up more constantly, and people should really understand that a lot of this has to do with American support for Israeli violence against these occupied populations, and essentially, like I said, we underwrite it. We're not allowed to dissent against it. If you do, you're an anti-Semite. You're not a good Christian. You're not a good Jew. You're not a good American. But I think what's happening now with all this footage coming out, and especially at times like this, people are becoming far more aware of what's going on, and it's harder and harder for people like Andrew Yang to go, just like New Yorkers, the Israelis will persevere, and this kind of garbage. Like, that doesn't fly anymore, which is why I'm really glad that hashtag came out that says Yang supports genocide or whatever it was, because people like that should be laughed out of the room. Absolutely. And never listened to again.
Yeah. The last thing I would note is just, while this is mainly about the Palestinians, it isn't just about the Palestinians for the war state. See here, Mark Dubowitz, the FDD guy, got 53 Republican, or I guess 44 Republican senators to sign a letter to Joe Biden saying that in light of the recent attacks by Hamas, the U.S. should under no circumstances provide sanctions relief against Iran. So they're trying to use this to undermine the getting back within the Iran nuclear deal. And then just to show how shameful the U.S. is, while all this is going on, they released a statement calling Xinjiang, China, an open-air prison. And so now, rather than when you Google search open-air prison, you see things about Gaza, which is, traditionally what, when people talk about open-air prison, they're talking about Gaza. Now it's about China. And so, look, the U.S. isn't afraid to make these statements about human rights. They won't make it when it comes to Israel because, the Israel lobby, ton of money there. Everybody read, it's right over one of my shoulders here, Israel Lobby and U.S. Policy by Mearsheimer. Absolutely fantastic. And also Stephen Walt. And then there is a lot more to this story though, with the Israel-Palestine thing. We can't get on everything today. We're only going on here for an hour, but continue to read about it because it's really one of the most important things going on. As Connor says, it could become very real for Americans again. You think about it, maybe this ends up being somewhat of a repeat of the 90s with it, doing Yemen to what we did to Iraq then, and then Israel launching these new campaigns against the Palestinians and these absolute acts of horror. But Connor, everybody check out the Libertarian Institute. He's there in the featured articles section. And what's your Twitter handle?
At Freeman's Mind 96.
All right, at
Thank
Freeman's
you
Mind
again, guys.
96. And then Will Porter is at the Will Porter on Twitter. He writes at RT.
Correct.
And you can also find him at the Institute. I'm also at the Institute every day. I write the news roundup, and then, of course, this show 3 days a week. You can also check out the show on YouTube and Odyssey, and Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. And then get your CBD products at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Thanks, Connor. Thanks, Will.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
guys.